The chandeliers glowed above the hall like distant stars, casting soft light over one of the world's most exclusive gatherings. Inside the Geneva Peace Forum, presidents, billionaires, diplomats, and celebrities mingled in a room thick with ego, power, and carefully hidden insecurity. Everyone was watching everyone. And yet, two men stood apart, not by status, but by silence. At a table near the far end, Will Smith sat quietly, shoulders slightly hunched, fingers tapping the side of his glass. This was his first major public appearance since that night, the night the world stopped seeing him as the hero. No cameras followed him now. He wasn't the blockbuster star or the charismatic king of awards shows. He was just a man walking through the long shadow of a moment he couldn't take back. Across the room, seated alone without entourage or fanfare, was Ibrahim Traoré. No tuxedo, no scripted smiles, just a plain military jacket, worn boots, and the calm composure of someone who had seen more loss than most people in that room could imagine. The president of Burkina Faso didn't need to speak to be noticed. His presence said enough. They came from different worlds, one from Hollywood, the other from the heart of a continent often ignored. But both had tasted global attention, both had been celebrated and judged, and both carried something the room didn't know how to name. They weren't meant to meet. They weren't expected to speak. But history doesn't care about seating charts. That night, something happened. Off camera. Away from the speeches and applause. A quiet exchange that would ripple far beyond the walls of that golden hall. A conversation that reminded the world of something we so often forget, that healing doesn't come from winning, it comes from being seen. Will had been invited, but he wasn't sure why he said yes. Maybe he missed being part of something. Maybe he just wanted to disappear into a crowd that wouldn't ask him questions. But now, seated at a long table with names he barely recognized, he could feel the weight return, the same eyes, the same judgments. They didn't have to say anything. The silence said it for them. He forced a smile when someone asked about his latest project. There wasn't one. His fork clinked against the plate a little louder than he meant it to. He stopped eating. He stopped pretending. He leaned back and let the noise of 100 conversations wash over him like static. Across the room, Ibrahim Traoré sat with his back straight and his face still. He wasn't here for the photo ops. He had declined the spotlight, the press interviews, even the private dinner with foreign ministers. When the organizers asked where he preferred to sit, he simply said, "Anywhere quiet." But the room wasn't quiet. Every few minutes someone glanced at him and then looked away. Some nodded with respect. Others whispered. He was the leader who had kicked out French troops, the president who refused to play the game, the man who called out the system and still walked with peace in his voice. He didn't smile much, but when he did, it didn't feel like a performance. It felt like memory. For a long while the two men sat at opposite ends of the room, orbiting each other like distant planets, one haunted by a mistake, the other shaped by many. Then, during a break in the speeches, Will stood up. He needed air, and he wasn't the only one. Traoré rose, picked up his cup of tea, and walked toward the garden. Two paths, one garden, and a conversation no one had planned. The garden behind the forum was small, quiet, and deliberately underwhelming. Just a gravel path, a few benches, and a narrow stretch of trees that rustled in the wind like they were keeping secrets. Will stepped outside first, shoulders dropping slightly the moment too. His door closed behind him. He took a deep breath, the kind you take when the weight inside becomes heavier than the room you're trying to hold it in. He didn't expect company, especially not from the man already there. Ibrahim Traoré stood at the far edge, facing the trees, a plain wooden cup in his hands. Not porcelain, not gold, just wood, simple and still warm with tea. He didn't turn around when Will approached. He just said, "Some rooms echo more when they're full." Will smiled faintly. "Is it that obvious?" Traoré turned slowly, nodding once. "You're not the only one they look at with rehearsed eyes." Will walked closer, unsure whether to speak or retreat. But something in Traoré's expression told him he didn't need to explain himself. Not here. "I didn't come to impress anyone," Will said softly. "Didn't even want to be here, to be honest." Traoré took a sip of tea, then replied, "Then maybe you're the only honest man in the room." They stood there for a while in silence, two men from worlds so far apart they might as well have spoken different languages. And yet they understood each other perfectly. Not through words, but through weariness, through the quiet recognition of what it means to fall, to stand again, and to carry weight no one else sees. Will glanced at Traoré's cup. "You always drink tea in silence?" "I don't drink it for the taste," Traoré said, eyes still calm. "I drink it to slow the world down. When everything feels loud, I need to find the part of me that listens." Will looked down at his own hands, once celebrated, now shaky. "That's what I lost," he whispered. "The part that listens." Traoré didn't respond right away. Then he said, "It's still there. It always is. Sometimes it hides behind the noise of applause, or the silence after it's gone." And just like that, the distance between them disappeared. Will shifted his weight, his voice quieter now, like he was afraid of hearing himself say it out loud. "You ever make a mistake so public it rewrites everything you've ever done?" Traoré didn't answer right away. He just looked up at the sky, then back at Will, his eyes steady. "The world is loud when it watches you fall, but it gets very quiet when you try to rise." Will nodded slowly. "After the slap, I tried to explain it, to justify it. But deep down, I knew I didn't need a microphone. I needed a mirror." Traoré stepped closer. "Anger always promises to protect us, but it usually ends up robbing us first." Will chuckled sadly. "You sound like someone who's lived it." "I have," Traoré said, sipping his tea again. "I once watched a man insult my mother in front of our village. I had a gun in my hand. But I remembered something my uncle used to say. If you raise your hand in rage, you're building a wall between who you are and who you could have been. So I lowered it." Will looked at him, genuinely taken aback. "What did you do instead?" "I wrote his name down," Traoré said. "Not to curse him, but to remember who I didn't want to become." The words hung between them, soft but sharp. For a long time, neither man spoke. The air between them was no longer heavy. It was honest. Will exhaled slowly, as if something inside him had finally shifted. "You know, people still talk about that one moment, what I did on stage, but no one asks what I've done since." "They will," Traoré replied. "Not because you explain it, but because you live differently enough that they feel it." Will looked up, eyes glassy. "What if I'm still trying to figure out who that man is?" Traoré gave a small smile. "Then you're exactly where you need to be, because the man who questions himself is far more dangerous than the one who never does." Long before the forum, long before the garden conversation. There was silence. He picked up a pen anyway and scrawled something in the center. "What does strength without peace feel like?" He paused, looked at the words, then wrote underneath, "Hollow." The sound of his own breath was the only thing he could hear. His phone buzzed, but he didn't move. The world had moved on, already choosing sides. But he wasn't fighting the world anymore. He was fighting the version of himself that broke through the mask, the one he didn't recognize. He looked at his hands, the same hands that had built careers, held awards, wiped his children's tears. And still they had failed him in the moment that mattered most. Somewhere in the corner of the room, an old family photo sat crooked on a shelf. Will stood and adjusted it gently, brushing off the dust. He stared at the image of a younger man, smiling, hungry, proud, and whispered, "I'm sorry you had to watch that." Then he sat back down, not to perform, not to plan, but to listen to the silence. Because sometimes healing starts in the moment no one else sees. Before the titles, before the uniform, before the world knew his name, Ibrahim Traoré was just a boy sitting on red earth, watching the sun set over a village that never seemed to change. He was 7 when it happened. His mother had sent him to fetch water from the nearby well. On the way back, he saw a soldier stop his uncle in the middle of the road. The man wore crisp boots, mirrored sunglasses, and a smirk that could split bone. He accused his uncle of speaking out against the government, of stirring the people, of forgetting his place. Without warning, the soldier raised his hand and struck him, hard. The crack of the slap echoed through the still afternoon air. Ibrahim froze, water sloshing from the bucket. His uncle didn't fight back. He didn't even raise his voice. He looked up at the man who had humiliated him and said only one thing. "One day the land will answer louder than I can." That sentence stayed with Ibrahim forever. That night, he couldn't sleep. His uncle's cheek was still swollen, his pride even more so. Ibrahim sat outside, staring up at the sky, trying to understand how someone could have so much power and so little honor. He promised himself something that night, not to be strong like the soldier, but to be strong like his uncle, to hold back when anger demands a show, to choose restraint, not because you're weak, but because you're free. Years later, when the world began to know his name and power finally sat in his hands, he kept that memory folded like paper in the pocket of his soul. A slap taught him that violence can win an argument, but silence, silence rooted in dignity, can win a nation. Back in the garden, the air had shifted. Will leaned against the low stone wall, eyes fixed on the shadows beneath the trees. He had spoken more in the last 10 minutes than he had in the last few months, and still one question burned in him, something he had never dared to ask, until now. "How do you carry their hopes?" he asked quietly, "without letting it crush you?" Traoré turned to look at him. His expression didn't change, but something in his eyes did. Softer, sadder, wiser. "You don't carry them," he said. "At least, not forever. You hold them for a while, until the people can stand again, and then you let them carry you." Will was silent. Traoré took a step forward. "When I first became president, they asked me if I was afraid. I said yes. Every day, because I'm not standing in front of my people. I'm standing in their place." Will stared at him. You're not afraid to say that? I'm more afraid of pretending I'm not. Will looked down at his hands again. The world sees my mistake. I see the shame that came after. But I'm still figuring out who I'm supposed to be next. Traoré nodded. Then you are already ahead of most men. The ones who scare me are the ones who stop asking. There was a long pause. Not uncomfortable, just real. And then Traoré asked something that caught Will completely off guard. Do you still dream? Will blinked. What? Dream, Traoré said. Not about fame or fixing things. I mean the kind of dreams you had when no one knew your name. Will smiled slowly. I used to dream of making people feel something. Not entertain, not impress. Just feel. Traoré's voice dropped to almost a whisper. Then maybe it's time to remind them. In that moment, Will wasn't the man from the tabloids, and Traoré wasn't the president with headlines of rebellion. They were just two men, both bruised, both standing, both choosing dignity over noise. And for the first time that evening, Will didn't feel watched. He felt understood. Inside the forum hall, the energy had shifted. The keynote speaker had finished early, and murmurs filled the room as attendees shuffled back to their seats for the closing segment. Most expected one final speech, something diplomatic, predictable, rehearsed. The MC stepped up to the podium, smiled politely, and cleared her throat. We'd like to invite President Ibrahim Traoré to offer a few words. A ripple moved through the crowd. Some leaned forward, curious. Others braced for defiance. But what followed wasn't anything they could have anticipated. Traoré walked in slowly, not with a written speech, not flanked by aides, not even looking at the cameras. Just him, quiet and steady. He reached the mic, looked across the room of world leaders, celebrities, and skeptical diplomats, and paused. Then he said something that stunned everyone. I won't be speaking tonight. Gasps echoed, cameras clicked. Instead, Traoré continued, I'd like to invite someone who reminds us that even when the world turns its back, a man can still turn toward something greater. And then he turned and gestured toward the side of the stage. Will Smith stepped out. No one clapped. No one moved. Even Will hesitated at first, like he thought it might be a mistake. But Traoré gave him a small nod, the kind of nod that says, you belong here. Will took the stage slowly, 1,000 eyes pressing against him. He didn't carry notes. He didn't smile. He just gripped the microphone, looked down for a second and said, I thought I came here to disappear. He looked up. But someone reminded me. Sometimes your greatest role isn't the one you play. It's the one you become when no one's watching. Will stood still for a moment, letting the silence breathe. Not one phone buzzed. Not one fork clinked. The forum, known for applause and posturing, was frozen, waiting for the man they thought they knew to say something different. I used to think pain was something you had to hide, that if the world saw your cracks it would crawl through them and never let you forget. He took a breath. But the truth is, we all break. The only difference is what we do after. There was no performance in his voice, no rhythm or rise, just truth, plain and unshaken. I made a mistake, not just a moment, not just a slap. I let pride wear my skin. I let fear answer in my place. And for a long time, I believed I had ruined everything. He looked out over the crowd. Some stared. Others lowered their eyes. I wanted to fix it the way I fixed everything, through charm, through control, through a clean ending. But healing doesn't happen in a perfect scene. It happens when you stay, even when it hurts. People in the crowd began shifting, not out of discomfort, but from the weight of recognition. Will continued. A man I met tonight reminded me that leadership isn't about always getting it right. It's about refusing to look away from yourself, from your people, from the truth. He looked over at Traoré. He didn't give me advice. He didn't give me pity. He gave me silence. The kind that lets you hear tea. He part of yourself you forgot. A few people began to nod. Others leaned in closer. So no, I didn't come here to speak. I came here to listen. But if there's one thing I'll say before I leave, it's this. He paused. You are not your lowest moment. You are what you choose to become after. Then he stepped back from the microphone. No applause followed, just a hush. The kind of hush that lives in churches, in graves, in truth. And in that stillness, something powerful happened. The room finally saw the man. Not the actor, not the controversy, just the man. Will stepped off the stage without looking up. He didn't wait for applause, he wasn't expecting any. But what he heard next wasn't clapping. It was silence. And then the sound of someone standing. It was Traoré. He didn't speak. He just walked to Will, placed a firm hand on his shoulder, and nodded. Not in approval, but in solidarity. Two men, different battles, same courage. Together they walked out of the hall, not through the VIP exit, not toward the press, but straight through the middle of the crowd. The sea of suits and stares parted slowly, not because of fear, not even because of fame, but because of something deeper. Respect. As they passed, a woman whispered to her daughter, "That is what strength looks like." Outside, the night air was cool and calm. No reporters followed, no flashing lights, just the quiet crunch of footsteps on gravel and the weight of something invisible but sacred. Redemption. A young intern near the door, barely 20, watched them leave with wide eyes. She had been the one handing out programs earlier. She didn't speak English well, didn't know much about either man, but as they passed, she pulled out a pen, scribbled something in her notebook, and smiled. It said, "You can fall and still rise with dignity." And in the darkness, two men kept walking, not as president and actor, not as headlines or hashtags, but as reminders that healing is never loud. And the strong, just men are the ones who know when to sit in silence and when to rise again. In a world addicted to noise, the most powerful moments are the ones no one sees coming. That night at the Geneva Peace Forum, the headlines didn't capture what really mattered. They talked about the names, the handshake, the surprise. But they missed the silence between two men who had nothing to prove, yet everything to share. They didn't trade philosophies, they traded humanity. One, an actor who fell from grace and chose to stand again, not for applause but for honesty. The other, a soldier who became a president, not by conquering others, but by mastering himself. They came from different worlds. But in that quiet garden, they spoke the same language. Pain, redemption, dignity. And maybe that's the story we needed, not one about scandal or power, but one about what it means to break and still choose to build. Because sometimes the strongest thing a man can do isn't fight, it's forgivable. And sometimes the most important thing a leader can say is nothing at all. If this story moved you, if it made you stop, reflect and breathe, don't let it end here. Like this video to keep this message alive. Comment, "I believe in second chances," if you've ever felt the weight of regret or the power of growth. And subscribe to Honor Restored for more stories that remind us power isn't in the spotlight. It's in the quiet choices that change everything.